Welcome to Poly Pomona's URP 3350 class, Planmaking History and Future. Today's presentation is on the book, Urban Land Use Planning by Berke, Godschalk, Kaiser, and Rodriguez. This is going to focus on Chapter 10. My name is Professor Scott Reimers. So Chapter 10 focuses on 4 major points. The first one is the preparation for plan making. So what do you do in order to, before you start actually making that plan? And there's 4 subpoints within that. The first is you're going to set up some sort of organization and principles for participation. So that's when you might set up your general plan committee. They're going to delineate or show you how big the plan area is going to be. And then you're going to work with them to connect and see what are those connections between other local plans that are out there. And then you're also going to work with them to coordinate with other governments. So that's that first step, the preparation of the plan making. Once you've done that, you're going to work on different components within the plan making process. And so that would include your state of the community report. In Pasadena, we called it, we had both a metrics report and an outreach report. And then you're going to set some direction, and that's going to be through setting your policies, your goals, objectives, and policies document. Then you're going to do the actual plan creation. And then the part that we always forget, the part that we leave out the most often, is the monitoring, making sure that you're continuing to monitor that plan. The third major point that we're going to focus on is designing spatial arrangements of land uses. So that's when you actually start mapping stuff. So you're going to create some principles for growth in your community and principles for keeping things consistent. You're going to locate where some different areas that are suitable and not suitable for growth are. And then you're going to estimate how much capacity you need. And also at the same time, you're going to also be looking at how much space you're going to need to meet that capacity. And then you're going to design that urban framework. And then lastly, there's ordering the different land uses. And so that's when you're going to first go out and start showing where you're going to put open space and where you're going to preserve that open space. Then you're going to start to look at where do we need to put regional land uses like large airports and things. And then once you focus on the regional, then you're going to focus on local land uses. So before you start creating the actual plan, there's some other groundwork that you need to do first. And one of those is to set up your task force. And that task force or organization can be called a lot of different things. In Pasadena, we called it the General Plan Advisory Committee. You might just hear of a General Plan Committee. Sometimes your Planning Commission might act as your task force. But generally, cities will set up a general plan committee so that they can get a lot of representation. You don't want too many people on your committee. I've had 22 people on a committee once, and that was really hard to manage. But you do want to try and get broad participation in that committee. So where your planning commission might have like everyone on the planning commission is a realtor or everyone's a contractor, you can hand pick that committee to make sure that you maybe have like a realtor, a developer. You might have somebody that represents some of your neighborhoods. You might have people who are representing environmental interests, but you want to make sure that you're getting a lot of broad support there. You might have one representative of the commission, the planning commission, or if you have like a design review commission and a historic preservation commission, you might put representatives from each of those commissions on your committee. The other thing you're going to want to have on that committee is your qualified staff. And what I mean by that is might not necessarily be you. As a planner, you might have a lot of background on doing current planning, but you might not have a lot of background on doing long-range planning. And so that's why a lot of cities bring in consultants to help with that long-range planning work. You also want to make sure that that broad involvement is leading to broad support. So the more involvement you're getting, the broader that involvement, the more support you're going to get from other people in the community who believe that that general plan has had a representative on your commission or on your task force, and that they can look at the plan and go back and see how that person interacted, and there are policies that represent those people's interests. So the other thing that you're going to need to do early on is to prepare for that plan making is to delineate the planning area. And this might seem very simple, and in many cases it is, You're going to determine the boundaries. So for a general plan, that's usually the city boundaries plus. So in California, um, each city is assigned a sphere of influence. And a sphere of influence is an area that's adjacent to the city that kind of functions as a piece of the city, but is in unincorporated county. It's not been incorporated into a city yet. And so the thinking is that um, if that area is going to become a city, the city should start planning today for what would the correct zoning be or the correct general plan designation be for that area. So you'll be responsible for planning in the sphere of influence as well. So for instance, as the Santa Clarita is surrounded by unincorporated county, and slowly Santa Clarita kind of annexes in pieces of the county as it continues to grow. So Santa Clarita continues to plan for that sphere of influence, knowing that eventually it will probably annex those areas. You might, if you're doing a specific plan, look at certain areas, or you might be focusing within a certain region of the city. But if you're doing a specific plan, it is better to start off larger, and then you can always kind of decide that you want to narrow that down in scope. The third thing you want to do before you start planning is start looking at other local plans and programs. And so there's other community plans that are out there. You might have specific plans in place that the general plan may want to look at. If you're doing a specific plan, you're going to need to look at the general plan. And then you probably also have a lot of infrastructure plans that are in place, both from the city or maybe from some private infrastructure, so like a water company. So you're going to need to start gathering all of those pieces if you have transportation plans, like a bicycle plan, a pedestrian plan, if you have an urban water plan, or if you have a storm water plan, or a sanitary sewer plan, you're going to need to start pulling those together. And part of your work is going to be figuring out how much capacity each of those plans demonstrate, and what they were forecasting in terms of growth. So those plans may need to be upgraded or updated with the general plan because the general plan is going to be proposing additional growth. And so you're going to need to make sure that you have sufficient sewer capacity or stormwater capacity to meet that growth. And that's why consistency is key, both if the general plan's expanding growth or the specific plan is proposing more growth, you may need to update some of those plans. So those are local plans. You also need to look to make sure that you're coordinating with other governmental agencies. So if there's one shared resource, like you're in a big water basin and you're drawing on the same water as everyone else, you need to make sure that you're working with your water agency. If there's environmental systems that cross boundaries, as they normally do, you're going to need to make sure that you're working together with some wetland protection agency or with the California Coastal Commission. And then if you're adjacent to county unincorporated areas, you're going to need to look up what the county general plan is showing in terms of growth for that, and you may want to take that into account. You may want to look at other cities with bicycle plans. Often one city will do its bicycle plan without thinking about what the adjacent city is doing, and that doesn't allow for people to kind of cross jurisdictional lines. So making sure that you're looking at what other cities' general plans look like. And then you may need to coordinate policies with those other governmental organizations. So in the diagram below, we have the plan making process. So that starts with the state of community report. Then you're going to set some direction framework, then create the plan, and then monitor the plan. And putting together in that first stage, the state of community report was a part of the project that I really enjoyed in Pasadena. In Pasadena, it was kind of a two-document resource. One was very much focused on looking at where the community stood in terms of certain issues and what their opinion of those issues are, and what issues kind of rose to the surface as we were doing community outreach. So we spent a whole year just doing community outreach. We did big events, we did small events, we created toolboxes so people could do their own event in their homes. We organized tours, did all sorts of things to try and get people's input. We had a website, we had social media where we were collecting all this information. And at the beginning, we started with focus groups. And as part of that, we just asked people, what do you like and what don't you like? Very open-ended, and we just continued to put together graphics demonstrating what people liked and what they didn't like in order to demonstrate kind of the community's pulse and where we started to put things in categories so we could get their sense of what were people's feelings regarding transportation, what were their feelings regarding land use, culture, arts, all sorts of things. And it was kind of often another thing you might do is a SWOT analysis, strengths, weakness, opportunities, and threats. And you start asking people, what are the city's strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are our opportunities, and what's threatening us? Throughout the process, we focused on a lot of that. We asked people to prioritize issues. So after we asked people, what do you like and what don't you like? We then asked them to kind of prioritize, what are the most important issues in the community? And then we prepared one large report that talked about each of these themes throughout that year. There was another part which was called the metrics report, where we looked at where the city had been since 1994 up into about 2004, and tried to look at a number of different metrics to see how the city had grown and to see what issues there were in terms of growth. So we looked at population growth over time. We looked at how the economy had changed and where the economy was headed. We looked at how the environment had changed. We looked at social equity figures. We looked at how much affordable housing the city had built and how productive its inclusionary housing ordinance was. Basically, any of the issues that people brought up in terms of what they liked and didn't like, if there was a way to measure that issue, we put together a report to look at those measurements. And that was published in a separate document. Another thing you might do is just look at the history of the city and prepare a document on the city's history. So you could look at history, existing conditions, and you could look at all of the issues through your SWOT analysis. That SWOT analysis, that first part that I talked about, will usually end with a vision statement. And that's kind of your jumping off point for the next piece of the plan. Okay, so the second step in that process is direction setting framework. And this is where you start to prepare goals, objectives, and policies. And I'll have to say, in writing a general plan a few times, this can be a very challenging part. One major challenge is that it can be very difficult to get community input on goals, objectives, and policies because they have to actually sit down and read it, or you've got to present it. And it can be a bit boring, but it's really important because these are the goals that future decisions are going to be based on. Should this land use plan be adopted? Well, does it meet the goals and objectives and policies? Should this project be approved? Well, does it meet the general plan goals and objectives? What should we do in our next year's work program for the planning department? Well, what are the goals, objectives, and policies of the general plan? So everything should point back to those goals, objectives, and policies. So what you set in terms of goals, objectives, and policies at this point is going to drive everything else later. So the purpose of this is to provide very clear, relevant basis for plan making, and it is based on three key pieces: goals, objectives, and policies. The first part, I just want to talk about goals at the beginning. Goals are an ideal future condition a community aspires to. An ideal future condition a community aspires to. It's what is that end state that you want to see 10 years later or 20 years later. It's not a way of doing something. It's not how are we going to get there. It's not quantifiable. You can't put a number to it. It generally is expressed as an adjective or a noun at the beginning. So for instance, a properly worded goal would be an adequate supply of affordable housing, or a vibrant downtown, or a healthy urban forest. Notice that those are not quantifiable things at this point. We're not quantifying how much affordable housing, and we're not saying how we're going to get there. We're just talking about that end state, okay? So that's goals. Objectives. Objectives are tangible. They are a measurable outcome, and it helps you lead to that goal. So it's kind of the how of a goal statement. Objectives, I will say, are kind of falling out of favor now. You might start to see some general plans that don't have objectives, and they just go straight from goals to policies. But again, the objective is something that's more tangible, it's measurable, it's going to lead you to that goal. So, so you might say in an objective that an adequate supply of affordable housing, if that's the goal, then the objective might be to meet the RHNA within an 8-year time frame. So that RHNA is going to be measurable at an outcome, and it's going to lead to the affordable housing goal you set earlier. Okay, so that's goals and objectives. Lastly is policies. These are the actions that you need in order to reach the objective, or if you don't have objectives, to reach that goal. So again, this is just going to say, what can you do to get to that goal? And these are going to start with a verb. And they're not going to be as detailed as an ordinance, but they're going to be a lot more detailed. They might also start to become measurable. So here we have some examples of goals, objectives, and policies. The first goal here is a compact and contiguous urban landscape that enhances the city's livability. And so you can see that it's written as an end state. It does not begin with a verb. It's not measurable. It doesn't tell you how you're going to get there. It's just setting a vision for the future. A compact and contiguous urban landscape that enhances the city's livability. Then objective 1.1 tells us how we're going to get there. So by 2030, we're going to achieve an average density of 10 dwelling units per acre. So that's measurable, it's quantifiable. It tells us how we're going to get to that, that livable, compact community. And then policy 1.1.1 even goes further down that step. So it says amend the development ordinance to establish minimum density requirements for all new large-scale subdivision proposals. So there we can see that we're getting even further into the weeds. So then the next step is, after you've set the framework in terms of goals, policies, and objectives, the next part of that is to actually develop the right plan and selecting the right type of plan to prepare. So there's 4 different types of plans that the authors pick out. The first is the area-wide plan. Then you have a community-wide land use plan, a specific plan, and a development management plan. The area-wide plan is generally an area where it would be used in an area where you have areas that haven't developed yet, and maybe some rural areas, and then you have more of an urban area. And in that area-wide plan, you would be noting which areas are going to be urban in the future, which areas need to be conserved, and which areas will stay rural. So part of a city like Santa Clarita that's continuing to grow, or a city or a county like Ventura, might start with that process of saying, here's where we're going to remain urban or continue to grow. Here's the area we're going to conserve, and then that might be like hillside areas, it might be natural areas, and then here are the areas that are going to be rural areas. The second type of plan that they mentioned is the community-wide land use plan, and that's what we think of in California as a general plan. It's setting a land use plan for the entire community, so it's going to show you what type of uses are going to be allowed where, and what the density of that use is going to be, either in terms of the number of people or units or FAR, some sort of density calculation. So it's going to start to look kind of like a zoning map, but a bit more general. So it might say this is a commercial only districts. These are areas where mixed use will be allowed. These are areas where residential uses will be allowed, and residential uses usually in a general plan are going to have different densities, so like single family, multifamily. And then you might also have some other uses like institutional land uses and so forth. So you got the area-wide, then you've got the community-wide land use plan. And then some cities decide to move on to doing specific plans. And that's where you would really zoom in to like the central business district or a neighborhood. And that you would then take the general plan designations and some of the goals or objectives that the general plan has for that area and really build that out into something that looks a lot more like a set of design guidelines with zoning code and a zoning map. And so you really get into densities there, what uses are allowed and not allowed. You have also, usually there's principles for, or there's design guidelines in there or objective design standards. And then there's also usually a component for what the public realm is going to look like. What is the street and the sidewalk going to look like as well? And then they talk about a development management plan. In California, I don't think you're going to see a lot of those anymore, just because with our RENA process, we kind of are limited about how we can manage development over time. So just note that if you're an infill city, you're likely not going to do an area-wide plan, or that's going to be part of your analysis under the community-wide land use plan. And the reason is that if you're an infill city, you've already kind of built out. So then you can kind of just jump directly to that community-wide land use plan. In Pasadena, what we did is the first part of that planning process we used after we set goals, objectives, and policies is then we moved to saying what areas do we want to preserve and where is it okay to see growth. And so people would circle, for instance, like single family neighborhoods, or they would circle areas they knew to be historic, or they would circle open space areas and say, well, we don't want to do development in there. And then everything else, they might circle like the central business district, and they might circle that area and say that's where we want to see growth. Or they might circle around a light rail station. They might say that's where we want to see growth. And then from there, we jumped into what uses and what type of development do we want to see within that. So monitoring and evaluating is the last step of that process. And within that process, it's probably what planners and cities do very poorly at. By the time you finally finish your general plan, maybe you're exhausted, maybe the focus has now kind of changed to doing other things. And so monitoring and evaluating whether the general plan is being implemented correctly kind of sometimes gets tossed by the wayside. So in California, the way we've dealt with that is that there are two reports that kind of help. And there's one report that goes to the State Housing and Community Development Department, where a city will report how well it's doing in terms of implementing its housing element and how well it's kind of responding to affordable housing and how much affordable housing it's building. And I should say market rate housing as well. And then the Office of Planning and Research also requires cities to submit their general plan implementation report. Both of those reports are due on April 1st of every year. They do have a grace period if you don't submit it on time. But that kind of drives cities to remember to monitor and evaluate their plan, to base their work program on implementing the general plan. And those reports generally have to go to either the Planning Commission or City Council for approval. Within your general plan, there should be a framework for implementation. And then you can kind of just report on, well, did we implement this part of the general plan within the specified time frame? Did we implement these programs in the housing element per the time frame we said that we were going to do? Now, when you're looking at a general plan, what do you want to look at? Well, first of all, you want to look at how is the city changing? Are we growing as we thought we would, or are we behind in growth? Are we growing too much? Are we seeing a different type of growth being very popular? Like, are we seeing a lot of ADU growth? Or are we seeing a lot of multifamily housing growth? Are we only seeing single family housing additions? So how are we growing? Are we seeing no office growth, but we're seeing a lot of growth in the retail sector? That's all stuff that would be helpful to know. Are we growing where we thought we would grow? Are we growing in the central business district, or are we growing on the outskirts? Are we making changes to the general plan and the zoning code because we're not meeting our objectives? And are we meeting those objectives? You might have a checklist of some goals I should say some objectives that were quantified, and are we meeting those? And then what needs to be updated based on that? Do we need to create a new specific plan? Do we need to do some zoning code changes to revise densities? Do we need to do an economic analysis to figure out why things aren't happening? So that's all part of what should be occurring during that monitoring and evaluation phase. So a few slides ago, I showed you a goal, objective, and a policy that was written per general plan requirements. I want to take a moment to show you some that are not done correctly and give you the chance to try and figure out what's wrong and what's right. So goal 2 says serve new development with public facilities that are efficient. Objective 2.1 says bring down costs of new services per household, down, bring the cost down. Policy 2.1.1 says we will coordinate public and private development by establishing an adequate facilities requirement and development regulations and in the capital improvement plan. And then goal 3 says a community with inclusionary housing requirements to reduce gentrification pressure. So what's not right in goal number 2? What's not right is that the line starts with a verb. A goal should not start with a verb. A verb kind of tells you how something is going to happen. What we're looking for is for goals to talk about an end state. What is the end objective? And so the end objective might be public facilities that run efficiently. That might be a way to change number 2, goal number 2. Objective 2.1 says bring costs of new services per household down. What's wrong with that statement? What's wrong with it is that it's not measurable. It's saying what direction it should head, but it's not saying how to measure that. Policy 2.1.1 says we will coordinate public and private development by establishing an adequate facilities requirement and development regulation and in the capital improvement plan. So what's wrong with that? What's wrong with it is that it doesn't start with a verb. Your policy should start with a verb, just like your objective. Goal number 3. A community with inclusionary housing requirements to reduce gentrification pressure. What's wrong with that? Again, what's wrong with it is that it doesn't, it's not end state focused. It's more how to do something. So the goal should be end state focused. Okay, so the next step in the process is to design the spatial arrangements of your land uses. So how are land uses going to be arranged? How are you going to arrange residential uses and commercial uses and industrial uses? The first part of that is to create some location principles. And you're going to do that for each different type of land use that you have. So you're going to do that for residential uses, commercial areas, mixed use areas, industrial areas. And then for each of those, after you create the location principles, you're going to go through steps 2 through 5. So you go through steps 1 through 5 for residential, 1 through 5 for commercial, and 1 through 5 for mixed use, and so on and so forth. So what does this mean, create location principles? It means if we were doing this for a residential area, it might mean that you're not going to allow residential development to occur on a brownfield site, a site that's had a toxic history. You're not going to allow development to occur within a 100-year floodplain. That might be another location principle. You might say that residential areas have to be buffered from industrial areas, or that single-family residences will be buffered from commercial areas. You might say that habitat corridors will have appropriate setbacks from development areas so that you create a good buffer between your habitat corridor and your development area. You might say all agriculture areas will be preserved, or employment areas will be placed within a quarter-mile radius of light rail. These all take a land use and then tell you some sort of principle based on location. Another one might be neighborhoods should have access to local serving retail within a 15-minute walk. It's kind of a standard. It could also be a principle. So that's creating the location principles. So in the next step of that process, you're going to map location suitability. So you're going to take all those implications that you wrote in step 1 and you're going to start mapping them. So for the residential section, where you said, for instance, you might not allow any more residential units to be developed in a 100-year floodplain, you're going to show where the 100-year floodplain is. If you're going to require all new commercial development to be within a quarter-mile walk of a light rail station, then you're going to map your light rail stations and you're going to map where that quarter mile radius is. So that's going to start to show you where land is not suitable and where land is suitable for development. So any location principles that you can map, you're going to map them at this stage. But this is not yet a land use diagram. It's just trying to map out those location principles that you wrote. So after you created those location principles for each land use, and then you've mapped them, and you've mapped all those location requirements, then you're going to estimate how much space you need. So you're going to look at projections for commercial and residential development. How much more residential development do we need? Well, you might take your 8-year RENA projection in California, and you might double it or triple it so that your general plan can last 2 or 3 cycles. Or you might see how much land will be needed to meet projections in terms of commercial growth. There are some economic factors you can use to see how much commercial growth will be needed to serve residences, or how many more jobs will be needed to serve residences, or if you want to create a better jobs housing balance, how much more commercial development or residential development you need to create. And then so you're going to estimate those requirements. So in step 4, you've taken your location principles for each land use. You've mapped out anything that needs to be mapped out, like floodplains or buffers from light rail stations. Then you've estimated your space requirements, and now you're going to analyze the holding capacity. So you're going to do this for agricultural lands, for all vacant land, for underdeveloped land. And what you're going to do is first calculate the number of acres. So how many acres of single-family properties do I have, of single-family zoned areas? How many acres of industrial space do I have? You're going to calculate the number of acres for each of those things and figure out how many employees you can fit in there, or how many people you can fit in there. So an example of doing this is, if let's say you have 100 acres, and the land's being used for single-family residential development, that's generally 6 dwelling units per acre, then it has a capacity for 600 dwelling units. Now, if you have the capacity for 600 dwelling units, you can convert that to population by taking the average persons per household in that area. So a common number that you can use off the top of your head is 2.5 people per household. So you take your 600 dwelling units, multiply it by 2.5, and then you could find that the carrying capacity for that district is 1,500 people. So then the last stage of this process is to design the future urban form. And as part of this, you're going to invent alternative land use and transportation scenarios. That's really beneficial when it comes to CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which requires you to look at alternatives. So this part fulfills also your CEQA requirements. So you need to come up with some multiple schemes. Maybe that means try putting more residential development and commercial development in your central business district. And then maybe another scheme is keeping that central district more office oriented and putting residential uses along a light rail further down the line. So that might be one alternative. So you do need to keep in your mind that there has to be that tie between land use and transportation throughout all of your different schemes. In Pasadena, we had I think we had 4 different general plan alternatives that we were looking at. And the way we framed those was, one was kind of a reduced capacity alternative. One was focused on economic development, and one was focused on sustainability. And I can't think off the top of my head what the last one was. So when you are developing these different land use plans, there's kind of 3 different steps you should focus on. You should always start with your land use planning with open space first. These are areas that are usually sensitive and you can't move them. They can't be rebuilt somewhere else. If you have a natural stream running through the community with like an oak forest, that's not something you can develop and then move it somewhere else. You've kind of got to keep it in its place. So that's an area you're going to note first. These are areas that you're going to preserve for open space. So after you've planned out all your open space, then you're going to start looking at regional land uses. These are uses that usually take up a lot of room. They're more dependent on infrastructure. So this might be something like a sewer treatment plant, or even an airport, maybe a major transportation hub. You're going to want to plan out those first because they take up a lot of room, or they might need a lot of buffering, given that the use is very intensive. So that's kind of your next step. And then your last step is your local serving uses. And so you've done your open space, then you do your regional, and then you do your local uses. And so that's going to be your residential communities, local serving commercial uses, your neighborhood parks and such. So that basically is the plan making process. Just as a means of summary, that first portion we talked about preparing for the plan making process. So what do you need to do before you actually start the planning process? We talked about setting up your organization and setting some rules, some ground rules for participation. So we talked about the general plan committee. We talked about the delineating how big your plan area is going to be and how to connect it with both other local plans and other governmental organizations, whether they're higher up or as kind of sister relationships. Then we talked about the components for produced by state in the plan making process. So that's when you create your state of community report, your direction setting framework. We talked about the difference between a goal, an objective, and a policy, where you start the actual creation of a plan and then how you monitor that plan. We talked about designing the spatial arrangements of land uses, and that's where we talked about first creating those principles of the relationship between each land use and where it should be on a map. Then we talked about mapping those actual locations. So like where's the floodplain, where are the light rail lines, and what's a quarter-mile radius from there. We talked about estimating your space requirements and analyzing holding capacity. How much development do you need? What are the projections that are out there? And how much is your proposed plan providing? And then we talked about developing some different alternatives after that. And then we talked about the order of considering land uses, that you usually want to start with your open space areas, your regional land uses, and then lastly, your local serving uses. So thank you for watching.